So I think Beck's work has provided a powerful prism through which to grasp many of the key transformations of our age. As has already been brought out, in many ways, risk society is it's a theory of uncertainty as much as it is of determinate risk. And in particular, I found it useful for a kind of theory of unintended consequences, and then traces back to much of the history of social theory. The question of the risk society thesis, it's been extensively debated. I've partially participated in it. I think of that question, though, as a subset of a more general question, which is how useful is the risk society model or paradigm, or providing us with a toolbox? Not necessarily did Beck get predictions right or wrong, but does he ask fruitful questions, right? Does he provide paths forward? And in that, I have found Beck's work hugely useful, even though in many ways I actually wrote a paper once that said every time Beck wrote on class, he was wrong, but he was always usefully wrong. And in fact, he spurred literatures in how excellently wrong he was on that, even though he's right on many others. It's kind of like Hobbes. Hobbes is famously wrong about authority, but it's so fruitful, we're still working through it. So thinking about, for me, what is the kind of the core element of this model of the risk society? I think it focuses on the production, definition, and distribution of risks, and how this becomes a core problem in contemporary societies. And the focus for him in particular is on low probability, high damage risks that are ex ante unpredictable. And so even though Beck didn't use the word in risk society, it's very much a kind of precursor of a theorizing of systemic risk. And I think that has helped to undergird much of the kind of applications and extensions of his work. And this type of systemic risk is hard to rationalize and hard to subsume under existing modes of risk management. And I think because of the reflexive element, this is not like a temporary problem. It's not like, well, new risks evolved, we'll modify our risk management, and then it's fine, because the risks are always evolving as well. And I think his fundamental vision, at least one of them, there's several, right? And his work definitely evolved, but I see it as this kind of us living in an age of side effects and a kind of systematic recklessness with the future. And I think some of the key themes that he brought out that continue to make me puzzle, firstly, the pernicious humanization of nature. It's a kind of very interesting rethinking of Marx. And in fact, a really famous STS scholar brought out how Beck's thinking on this humanization of nature is quite an interesting precursor to STS work and overcoming the kind of social nature divide. And I think Beck's also retains some of the agental elements that sometimes get lost in the STS work. In terms of the politics of risk, I think one of the most compelling elements is this idea of the ability of technology and technology and industry to create social fait accompli that governance can only deal with ex post. So technology and industry create social realities that then policymakers have to come to after the fact and then address. And in fact, I think in many ways it's a very interesting rethinking again of Marx's work on the Jewish question. And lastly, one that I continue to I teach on risk and we deal with all this, but the issue of reflexivity and the challenge to expertise. And for, Beck's discussion of reflexive scientization, the demonopolization of expertise by experts. But again, following with Beck's own work, this has created unintended side effects that, I don't think Beck anticipated, the questioning of vaccines or climate change skepticism. Nevertheless, thinking about this as a paradigm, I think it really brings out a lot of interesting things. In thinking about the risk literature as a whole, though, I have concerns about it really seems to have developed into these kind of two solitudes. We have the kind of objectivist risk society literature that don't always call themselves risk society, and of course there are other scholars on this, but talk about disasters, catastrophes, the future, the ugly future. And on the other hand, you have a massive amount of literature on the kind of culture of fear, the politics of precaution, the sense in which we're not in an age of crisis of risk, but rather a crisis of fear, a crisis of anxiety. And we have, even recently I've heard people say, are we using the word crisis too quickly, right? And I mean, in Alberta at the moment, they said that the major crisis is we're not selling oil at the right price. And it's hard not to feel like that is an inflation of the term crisis. Nevertheless, the groups that use this term feel it quite strongly, right? And it's not a kind of individual phenomenon. So we have this issue where we have a kind of, from the culture of fear perspective, is a breakdown not in the world, but in our ability to perceive the world. And what we have here is these kind of this divide in the risk literature, which I have, only recently I've definitely been on the one side of the literature, but this other literature says the real issue here is our inability to repress anxiety, our damaged ontological security. And in some sense, the real issue is we're just not perceiving where risks are, and we're seeing risks everywhere. Now, ostensibly, these seem like tensions, right? We have one, there are too many risks out there, the other, that we perceive too many risks. But I actually think that they're kind of locked in this pernicious dialectic. And that both the problem of the excessive production of risk and the breakdown in our ability to judge, perceive, and to risk, and to integrate fear and anxiety into an overall flourishing life. And in particular, I think there's a breakdown in trust in life. I'm seeing this increasingly. I think these things actually feed each other. In fact, they can feed off each other. Mary Douglas very wisely said that if we fear everything, then we really can't protect ourselves from anything, right? And I think there's this kind of this dialectic going on between the two of them. And I briefly just like to suggest that I think that part of the risk problem is that we're actually dealing with a series of overlapping problems in which they're kind of nested together, and solving the one tends to intensify the other, and vice versa. And I just briefly going to outline these Firstly, I think there's a massive issue when it comes to risk, scarcity, and inequality. There are massively unequal benefits from risks. Famous book, Climate of Injustice, other works on financial crisis, quite obviously. Some skimmed the benefits and avoided the risks. And so what we have here is a kind of systematic incentive to produce risk as long as you can avoid the consequences. And so this is a problem, but it also creates a divided politics between incumbents and those who are bearing the risk, between those who see themselves entitled, and the politics of scarcity intensifies all of this. The second problem, which I have referred to, is this subjective problem of a kind of diffuse sense of fear, anxiety, and enemies. And I think more generally, we're seeing now the distinction between I disagree with you and you're a terrible person is often collapsing. And there's a kind of deep fear of others, and a fear that I think is in many ways splitting politics and making it harder to address the other problems. Thirdly, I think there is to come back to Beck, there is the objective problem of excessive risk in terms of environment, most obviously. Finance continues to be a problem that we can pretend we fixed, but we're really just ignoring. Digital crises in terms of AI, social media, these are just juggernauts that create massive social risk and massive benefit for a few. And I think that risk is it's almost hacked us in a way that it builds on weaknesses in our civil society, limits in our democracy, but the splits, in particular around security, and these mutual claims for security are likewise further intensifying it. So it's not a hopeful message, I know. But it's always better, I think, to diagnose the problem. And in some sense, this risk conundrum is having a positive feedback effect. And something significant will have to be done to move us out of this
overlapping problem. Okay, thank you.